It's one thing about when you get as old as I am, your resume has to be pretty long, right? And as far as this book about Waukomis, goodness gracious, I never knew the real history. You get in there digging, and who knew about the Wheat and Cattle Company? Sure, so I'm seeing some heads nodding. And Debbie, were you one of the ones that the class that boycotted the junior-senior prom to go see Mo Bandy that night play? No. Apparently several did. And then who knew that there was a sport called donkey ball? Richard told me his rather large father got on a little donkey and played donkey ball. And he said that there's a little, I don't know if this was back in the day when what the alcohol laws were, but apparently some of the spectators were imbibing as they watched the donkey ball games proceed. But anyhow, this town has an amazing history that I'm finding out that most of the people who live here their whole lives don't even know all of it. But I feel very unworthy, to be honest with you, to be up here. I've never even heard of a church where the people hung in there and stood against all the powers, all the currents of society, and were determined to keep their local church, the voice of Jesus Christ, going to their local community. No matter what the society said, no matter what the crowd said, no matter even what their own denomination said. So I feel like y'all are the ones that ought to be up on a platform like this, and I ought to be down there looking up at you, seriously, learning from you as far as the courage and the diligence and the determination and the faith that you have kept the doors of this place open, and you are determined to keep it going. And Gene, I heard a rumor that if things proceed on this fall, there might actually be some sort of a marker, a stone monument of some sort erected on this property with the names of you people that have kept it going and would be founders of the next chapter of Christ's church in this town, on this location, so that all those who come after would know and never forget the shoulders of those whom they will be standing on. Indeed, you've been called for such a time as this, and that's the title of the sermon today, as I guess you all know. And I'm going to talk about a place long ago and far away that in many ways was quite similar to our own. This was a place and a time where there were empires that gave their people a semblance and a facade of freedom. But when you peel back the surface, there wasn't really that much freedom after all. And if you wondered about it, you found out that those empires enforced their rule with favoritism, capriciousness, underhandedness, deceitfulness, and violence. That they were rent with immorality and even debauchery. Gosh, does any of that sound familiar, Gene? The more things change, right? And yet, then as now, no power on earth can stop God's purposes with and love for His people, you. And I hope you all realize by now, in this sermon, you're not spectators of someone else's story. You're participants in this story. There are different chapters of it, but this is the chapter that you are an actual participant in. You are the ones that have been called for such a time as this, just like some of the people in the story today that I'm about to tell you were in their time. And if y'all are like me, I love it when the preacher gives me like 2 or 3 points or principles or takeaways. So if someone asks me later, well, what was the sermon about? I can at least appear like I was somewhat paying attention, and I can throw a couple of them out. So I'm going to give you 3 of those today. First is, today's story is set in a land of brutality and immorality. Secondly, that in that land, even God's own people, the faithful ones, the most faithful ones at least, were compromised and far from perfect themselves. And third and final, that nonetheless, even when they were faithless, God was faithful and used them as He'll use us in spite of ourselves. And I think a lot of us in this room need to hear that today and be reminded of that we're not out of the game because we tripped up again, or for the 10th time, or for the 1,000th time. So, as I said, first of all, this was a story set in a land of immorality and brutality. It was an evil empire. In fact, it was the most powerful empire in world history to that point. The Medo-Persian Empire stretched across 127 different provinces, or really countries, from India and Central Asia on the east all the way to Europe on the west, Egypt and Ethiopia and Africa on the southwest. It was an angry empire, for a defiant little people group of city-states out in the hinterlands called the Greeks had recently risen up and smashed, for the first time ever, this powerful, mighty overseers on earth, the Persian Empire, in the historic Battle of Marathon just a few years before, and sent them fleeing back to Asia with their tail between their legs. And amidst all of this great empire of 127 provinces were God's chosen people, the Jews, that because of their own sinfulness and their own falling away from their duty, had been carried off into slavery, into exile, into many different countries. We don't realize that a lot of times, that when the Jews were blown up, if you will, and carried into slavery, they were spread all over the world. It was their first dispersion, their first diaspora. Many of them landed in Persia, the central area of modern-day Iran, is where this story takes place. In a city that was then called Shushan, in a citadel where the king's tower was, Susa, but this was the capital city that was in modern-day Iran, not far from the border of Iraq. Came a time when there was a fateful banquet. I mentioned a moment ago that the Greeks humbled the Persians in this great battle of Marathon, and that's where the great Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas, the movie some years ago, 300, where the Greeks made their stand against the Persians. That was the war I was talking about. That's when the Persians threatened Leonidas and said, we have so many warriors, we're going to fill the sky so full of spears that you won't be able to see the sun for the arrows coming down on you. That's when Leonidas and the Spartans replied memorably, well, that's just okay with us. We love fighting in the shade. And they won that. And so now the Persian king Artaxerxes, referred to as Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, was determined to get revenge. And he called together the biggest meeting of his life. The leaders of all 127 provinces come to the capital of Persia. And it was a fundraising mission. It was to raise money so they could launch another campaign across the sea against the Greeks, put them down and consolidate their empire. But God has a way of humbling the proud, doesn't He? He had all these great leaders in these great countries that had come in for this meeting, and then He couldn't get His own wife, Vashti, to come to the party. It so enraged him that he asked what he should do, and his counselors said, we need to make sure, first of all, that every wife in the empire knows that whatever the husband says to do, you have to do it. Okay? This was not a kinder, gentler time. There were not equal rights for anybody in that time. I said a moment ago that there was kind of the surface, the facade of freedom, but that could be snapped away at the whim of the king in a moment's notice, and even lead to mass murder, even genocide of an entire people. Hold that thought here for a moment. We'll get back to that in a moment. It plays crucially into our story today. The other thing was that King Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, determined to get himself a new queen. So they put out a notice to the entire empire, from India to Europe and Africa. Bring the most beautiful, calmly intelligent, and charming women throughout the provinces. They're going to candidate to be my new queen. And at this point, the second point of the talk today about how God, even God's people were compromised and far from perfect, we meet our two heroes, Mordecai and Esther. Now, in most of our children's storybooks and so forth, they're just presented as pure and pristine and without sin. But that was actually far from the truth. Mordecai and Esther both, by the very names that they had, show that their families had submitted over from faithful Jewishness to the Babylonian culture that had actually conquered the Jews before they were in turn conquered by the Persians. So Mordecai and Esther were living in the culture and participating and submitting to the culture of the Babylonians and then the Persians, not their own Jewish culture of God. The fact that Mordecai immediately took notice and said, wow, Esther, we need to get you in there and have you apply for this position to be the queen of Persia, to be married to a pagan king. And what would you have to do to audition for that job, I wonder? Well, Esther was just as quick to say, I'd love to do that, and jumped right in. And by the way, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to know that of all the candidates, those that didn't win the queen's position, the runners-up would just probably have a position in the king's harem. All right? So to begin with, Mordecai and Esther were caught up and engulfed in the sewage of the culture that was around them. But even now, at that point, God began to work in His people in the midst of their own faithlessness with His faithfulness. For Mordecai, well, I should say Esther won that job, as you probably know, as the queen. She was given favor in the sight of those around the king, had a lot of advantages and rose, and the king loved her among all others. She becomes queen. Mordecai then providentially hears of a plot to assassinate the king. He just happens to be sitting somewhere and hears the plot, tells it through the new Queen Esther, and it gets to the king and they foil the plot. And then Mordecai will not bow to the person that ironically rises to the second position in the entire empire. The man now reporting directly to the king, a man named Haman, a wicked pagan. Haman was the second in charge of the entire empire. So if you'll imagine Mordecai on one side, representing the lineage of God's people, His covenantal people, the Jews, old Israel, and Haman, who was from the tribe of the Amalekites. You say, well, sounds kind of familiar from Old Testament. Well, the Amalekites had the dubious distinction of being the first people ever to attack Israel when they came out of Egypt in the Exodus under Moses as a free people. The Amalekites attacked them first. God's feelings about the Amalekites were pretty clear when He told Moses, in fact, He promised Moses, I will completely erase the memory of the Amalekites from under heaven, and I'll be at war with them. God said this, I will be at war with them from generation to generation. These were not a people in God's good sight. The next generation, God ordered Joshua to blot out the memory of the Amalekites forever. And then later, He told King Saul to utterly annihilate them, wiping them out from man to child, even down to the donkeys. And I think that was even before Donkey Ball, Richard. You remember that Saul held off in his own wisdom, and he angered God. In fact, that was a turning point in providential history. Saul lost his crown. Saul lost his destiny as the leader of Israel. He angered God. But he did ultimately put to the sword the king of the Amalekites. And it turns out that guess who was a descendant of that wicked king? None other than Haman. Meanwhile, Mordecai was a descendant, the same tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, that King Saul had been, that put to death the Amalekite king. So Haman hated the Jews among all things, beyond all things, and now had risen to the second position in the entire empire. And also, remember we talked about how that fundraising campaign that the king had where his wife would not come? Well, he raised a lot of money, and the Persian army and navy trekked back into Europe again to put down the Greeks. And once again, they were thunderously defeated at one of the great naval battles of history, the Battle of Salamis in the Aegean Sea, just off the coast of Greece. And so now the king, Ahasuerus, is desperate to raise more money, to set out again and avenge himself. He's getting more and more afraid politically of the power of the Greeks that are rising on his western flank. This is all going on while the intrigues of the empire are taking place in the king's court. And it's at this point that Haman comes to the king and deceitfully begins to tell him about this people that's living within the empire under their very nose. A numerous people spread through all the provinces. They have their own laws that do not follow the laws of Persia. That in fact, this may lead to them actually attempting to overthrow the empire, much as the Greeks are trying to do out in the west. Do you think that resonated with a frightful pagan king? Not only that, Haman said, but I'll take care of these people for you. I'll not only take care of them, but I have a way to do it. I've masterminded a plan. You've put your trust in me, sir. I've come up with a plan that will wipe these people out and will bring into you from their plunder an amount equaling 2/3 of the budget of your entire empire for a full year. So in current, I don't know, Gene, what's our budget now in America? Trillions? Yeah. I think our interest is trillions now. So think of that. I'm going to wipe out all your enemies and bring trillions into the treasury so that you can set back out against the Greeks. Do it, the king said. Never even knowing that it was the Jews that he was talking about, the race of which his own beloved wife, the queen, was a part. And our final point, how God is faithful and used them and uses us, my dear friends. And again, I emphasize, even in the midst of our faithlessness, the times when we drop the ball of our sin, of our besetting sin, of our repeated sin, God gives mercy to those who confess and repent. If you have to do it 100 times in a day, do it. Don't give up. And by the way, if any of you all want to join us, the beautiful chapel that Richard and Mo built over here at 7 a.m. every Monday through Friday morning, a couple of us are in there on our faces praying for this church, for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for this town, for this state, for this nation, for the Church of Christ. Come join us any morning you want. You can come in the back door of Mo's. Or I think you can come in Painted Buffalo, right, Karen? I don't know if she'll make you a mug of coffee like she does me, but she might. But God is faithful. This was the turning point. You know the psalm that talks about how when the night is black, fear not, for joy comes in the morning. And I need to say that to some of us in this room. We've been through those times. Your wife, Jean, her back. I mean, I know there are nights that seem black, and others of you in this room. God promises joy comes in the morning. He promises that joy comes in the midst of it. He will draw close to the brokenhearted. That's a promise. Do we know the promises, the many promises we have from God? We have so much power at our disposal. We need to read His Word each day and remind us of it. For at the very moment it looked as though God's people themselves were about to be as a race extinguished. That is when the turning point came from Mordecai. And we see this ambitious, conniving politician in a pagan land all of a sudden be struck to the quick, pierced in his heart. My people, my heritage. Maybe he remembered a faithful grandpa or uncle or praying grandmother that was hauled off in the exile and slavery by the Babylonians. And it finally hit to him, what have I done? To where have I come? What did I depart? Who have I forgotten? Who have I betrayed? for his response was not to figure out how to work this to his benefit. His response was to go into the streets weeping in public, tearing his clothes, putting on literal sackcloths and ashes, and then calling upon Esther. And I don't think I mentioned a moment ago that Esther was his younger cousin that he had taken on to raise as his own daughter when her parents perished when she was very young. And he got word to Esther and told her of this terrible plot. And so Esther immediately responded in great faith, like in all the Bible books that we've read, right? Knowing the parlance gene of the old timers, she crawfished. Yeah. Esther, remember, she was looking out for number one as well, apparently for a long time. Even when Mordecai laid all this before her, what was her real response? And I say this because we think of how we'd like to be, right? We in the room, and sometimes how we are. Well, this was how Esther really was. She responded, but the king only allows people to see him that he's called in, even the queen. If I go in without permission or invitation, he will kill me like he will anyone else. So I can't do that. That was her real response. Wait a minute, let's break that down. She was putting her own life ahead of the entire race that had produced her and given her everything she had, the talents, the abilities to rise to queen of the greatest empire in history to that point. Mordecai, though, God had gotten hold of him. Amen. He had gotten hold of him. He sent word back. Really, daughter? You may think as queen that you can escape this. And here's where we see the providential and mysterious and inscrutable hand of God entering in again into human history. But my dear daughter, if you do not help as queen, help will rise from somewhere else, and God will save his people. But you and your father's house will perish. He wasn't like a lot of these preachers today that just want to tickle ears, right? He gave her the straight scoop. Well, I'm happy to say that was the turning point for Esther. And her response back to Mordecai: go and gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, the capital, and fast for me. And by the way, fasting, I just encourage us all. God's word says to fast, right? When we have great needs, it says to pray, but it says to fast. And can I just encourage us that if you'll fast and you'll trust God with your appetite and some pain and a little bit of discomfort in the course of a 24-hour period or whatever, it is amazing what he will show you on those days when you think it's too much. It can't happen, or I can't keep it from happening. Don't just pray fast, get on your knees before the Lord. Don't tell people. Jesus said keep it secret. It's between you and God. How close do you think that draws you to God and him to you? When he knows the only reason you're hungry that day is because of him. And you're looking only toward him. Amazing things can happen, people. And that's immediately what Esther said. She knew her scriptures from somewhere as well. And she said, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. Meanwhile, my maids and I, we will fast as well. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and at the risk and peril of my very life. And these immortal words that resound through history for the benefit of all of us sitting in this room and all of our children. And if what? If I perish, I perish. Oh my God. Let us live a life that daily we're looking to God and saying, if I perish in doing what you want me to do, I perish, but I'm in your hands. Oh God the Lord, the King of my salvation, now has covered our heads in the day of battle. Well, God providentially gave her favor, and the third day she went to the king. He saw favor in her, he invited her in and offered her up to half his kingdom. What would be your request, my beloved queen, the love of my life, which she was? Her request was to have a banquet with just the king, the wicked second in command of the empire, Haman and herself, a 3-person banquet. Can you imagine how excited Haman was to hear this? A 3-person banquet with himself, the king and the queen. He was riding high. Remember that verse about how God's opposed to the proud? Haman decided, I'm going to go for broke. I've already got a date set on the calendar that the Jews are going to be exterminated across the entire empire. Now, by gosh, I'm sick of this impudent Mordecai who will not bow to me when I pass him like all the other officers of the court. Go, construct a gallows outside. He had a gallows made to hang Mordecai on the next day. But providentially, that one night, the king himself could not go to sleep. He was restive. I guess even his harem and his concubines and everything else he had could not help. So providentially, he asked for the book of the Chronicles of the kings of the Persians to read of his own empire's history. And it occurred to him, that assassination plot against me years ago, because by now, approximately a decade had passed since the beginning of our story. Who was that? How did that come about that plot was foiled? And only then did he read that it was Mordecai, the Jew, that had foiled the plot. So he ordered Mordecai to be honored, and for Haman, who had just constructed Mordecai's gallows, to lead Mordecai through the streets of the Persian capital and honor him. Can you imagine how upset that Haman was with this? So, as the banquet begins, remember who it was at the banquet? The king, the queen, and the assistant king, Haman. Mordecai's just been honored. The king has just realized that his life was saved by Mordecai. And Queen Esther arose and said, I don't need half your kingdom, sir. But if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, only let my life be given me back at my petition, and my people's lives at my request. And as the king's expression of shock came across his face, she said, oh, for we've been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, O king, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves only, I would have held my tongue. Although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss, but no, we've been ordered to be annihilated. So the king answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? And who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther stood and said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman before you. The king was so enraged, he departed the room. And as he departed the room, one of his other assistants said, who had overheard, said, you know, Haman himself just erected a gallows. He was going to put Mordecai on it. Did you know that? Meanwhile, Haman's inside lunging for Esther in panic, begging her for his life. The king comes back in the room and mistakes his lunge, thinks he's on top of everything else. He goes, after all this, and now you want to rape my wife too? That's what he said. The gallows you have made, they are made. Hang Haman on them. And hang him they did. And then the day that was set to be the destruction and annihilation of the Jews was instead ordered at Esther's request and turned. And what Moses did not do, what Joshua did not do, what Saul did not do, the Jews of the generation of Mordecai and Esther, in the midst, I remind us, of a wicked, debauched, and declining empire. Right? This was all in the middle of the Persian Empire. The Jews set upon their enemies and destroyed them utterly. From India to Greece to Egypt. The Jews were saved. Their enemies were killed. The Feast of Purim, those of you that know your Old Testament, one of the great Jewish feasts, was launched on that day. Ironically, the Jews did it, I think, in a manner of sarcasm, because the word pure had to do, it was the translation of the word lot. And Haman, when he was deciding what day he wanted the Jews destroyed on, they had cast lots. Back in that time, it was kind of like throwing dice. And that's how they decided the day. Those were called Purs. So the Jews said, we're going to initiate the Feast of Purim to remember this day that turned out to be not our destruction, but that of our enemies. And is celebrated to this day. Esther was honored like never before, given all the possession and the mansions of Haman. Within a very few short years, the king himself was assassinated by people within his own court. God is opposed to the proud. He brings down the mighty. He lifts one up and brings down another. And within perhaps half a dozen years, here came Ezra and the Jews coming back in large numbers to their homeland to rebuild the wall that the Babylonians had destroyed around Jerusalem. And then right after that, Nehemiah and other Jews to rebuild Jerusalem in the second temple of God, given permission by the Persian kings to do so and to reinstitute their own religion and faith. And as the book of Esther closes, we read that the greatness of Mordecai the Jew, remember that ambitious, selfish, conniving, smart guy that was climbing the way to the top and taking his daughter with him? Now it was the greatness of Mordecai the Jew, whom God had gotten hold of in his faithlessness and made him faithful. And he was now second to King Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. Mordecai was now second in the empire. And he was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren. And what did he do? He was always seeking the good of his own people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So I close, my friends. The Mordecais and the Esthers of Waukomis. For that's who you are. Like it or not, you have been called. I'm sure there were times in that story Mordecai and Esther had wished they had not been called to anything and were not there at all. But all of us in this room have been called as a new generation of Mordecais and Esthers. We live in a land of brutality and immorality. We live in a land where there's a patina, a facade of freedom, but a land awash in not just immorality and debauchery, but despair and hopelessness and spreading darkness, with more darkness from across the seas threatening to spread on top of all of that. And yet in the midst of that, God has called each and every one of us. Even if I can't stand to sing the hymn, even if I can't come to church and have to listen to the recording, which I've made, by the way, even if I've floundered and failed 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. Oh, but you don't know the history of my marriage or my family or how my children turned out or how I've turned out. You're no worse than Mordecai or Esther. You, not the founding fathers, brothers and sisters, not the settlers of the Cherokee Outlet, not the greatest generation. We love all of them. Not even our grandparents and our parents. We love them too. You are God's A-team that's now on the field, that He has put on the field to carry forth the banners of Christ, to defend and win back this town, this community for Christ in the midst of all the powers of darkness coming over it. And if there's one takeaway point I hope you leave with today, it's to ask God in your own heart, Lord, is that true? Is that really true? And then to listen for His answer. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'll say a quick word of prayer if that's okay, Gene. Lord, I pray for the Esthers and the Mordecais in this room, from the little children with their earaches to the basketball players, to the Willas and the Gingers, and the Debbies and the Karens and the Debbie's husband. I can't remember your name right now, brother. And the Jeans and the Glendas, all of you that have stood as watchmen on the wall. You've stood in the gap before God for the land, that He might not destroy it, just as Ezekiel did. Lord, that you would bless them, show them what their true vision is from you for the future, that the greatest chapters of this church would lie ahead in the months and years beyond. And thank you for giving me the privilege, the honor to speak to this wonderful company. In Christ's name I pray, amen.